The torches flickered against the cavernous walls, their smoke curling upward like black prayers toward a silent heaven. Beneath the earth, in a chamber carved from stone and shadow, 40 human figures knelt, their trembling silhouettes caught in the dim orange glow. The air was thick with incense and dust, the mingled scent of sanctity and rot. A silence more dreadful than any scream clung to the air, broken only by the sound of chains sliding over stone. At the center of this suffocating chamber lay a sarcophagus ornate, gleaming, a shrine of jade and gold prepared for the queen. Her body, embalmed and painted with the crimson and ochre of eternal beauty, rested with the solemn arrogance of one who had ruled both palace and temple. Her lips, once a weapon of seduction and command, now sealed in death, seemed to curl faintly, as if mocking the living who cowered before her. The queen had demanded more than a tomb. She had demanded loyalty that transcended death. She had decreed that no journey to the underworld could be made alone. Servants, dancers, guards, and handmaidens' 40 lives, bound to her in eternity, were chosen to descend with her into darkness. One by one, the attendants bowed their heads, their eyes darting to the heavy stone doors, as priests began chanting words that echoed like a dirge. The walls reverberated with drums, slow and thunderous, as if the earth itself prepared to swallow them. Outside, the world still bathed in sunlight. Inside, the chamber became the belly of night. Some whispered prayers, others tried to hold back sobs. The youngest, a girl of barely 15, who had once brushed the queen's hair with trembling hands, clutched at her robe, her lips moving in a silent plea for mercy that would never come. Another, an old guard with scars etched across his arms, knelt rigid and defiant, as if daring death itself to strike him swiftly. Yet all knew their fates had already been sealed the moment the queen breathed her last. The high priest raised his hand, and silence cut through the chamber like a blade. "She goes not alone," his voice boomed, echoing from stone to stone. "The queen carries her kingdom with her, as above, so below." And with those words, the last torch was extinguished. Darkness flooded the room, thick and absolute. The sound of stone grinding against stone followed the sealing of the tomb. The servants screamed, their cries muffled by the weight of rock. Some clawed at the walls, others collapsed into sobs. The chanting of the priests above ground faded, as the final stones locked into place, shutting out the world forever. Within the suffocating blackness, breath grew short, hearts raced, and the living began their descent into death beside the silent queen, who lay unmoved, untouched by their terror. Outside, the tomb was a monument of splendor. Carvings told of a ruler beloved, radiant, chosen by the gods. No inscription revealed the truth of the 40 shadows buried beneath. To the world, she would be remembered as a queen of beauty and power. But beneath the earth, her name became a curse whispered through the generations, a tale of loyalty twisted into horror. The story of this queen begins not with her birth, nor even with her reign, but with the night her tomb swallowed 40 souls alive. It is here, in the suffocating silence of stone, that her legend was sealed and her curse was born. The earth above the tomb was silent, but history is never still. To understand the queen whose burial became a prison for the living, one must travel back through centuries of dust, to the palaces where incense smoke curled against gilded rafters, and whispers of power bled into the stones. Her story did not begin in death, but in the feverish corridors of a court where ambition was a weapon sharper than any blade. She was not born to rule. In her earliest years she was a daughter of minor nobility, a girl raised amidst the rituals of a kingdom where gods were fed with blood and rulers claimed descent from the heavens. From the start, she learned that survival was not guaranteed by virtue or kindness, but by the ability to read the hunger in a man's eyes, the tremor in a rival's voice, the shifting loyalties that changed with the tides of power. The kingdom she grew within was a land of contradictions. The temples rose like mountains carved by mortal hands, their steps stained with the residue of sacrifices. In the marketplaces, merchants from distant lands brought silk, lapis, and spices, their voices rising above the bleating of goats and the clatter of bronze vessels. Yet, beneath the surface grandeur, lay tension, noble houses scheming against one another, priesthoods jealously guarding ancient rites, and the throne itself often unstable, its seat passed not by peace but by betrayal. The queen's ascent was marked not by inheritance but by cunning. As a young consort, she learned to weave her beauty into a weapon, her silence into strategy. When the old king died, poisoned perhaps by his own court, she emerged from the shadows of the harem into the blinding light of coronation. Some said she bewitched the priests, others whispered she struck secret pacts with rival houses, but none could deny the iron certainty with which she placed the crown upon her head, declaring herself not merely consort but sovereign in her own right. Her reign was cloaked in magnificence. Processions thundered through the capital, with war captives paraded in chains, the queen herself riding high on a chariot plated with bronze and ivory. Her eyes, painted with lines that cut like daggers, gazed upon her people as though she alone stood between them and the wrath of the gods. In temple murals, she was depicted with the sun in one hand and the serpent in the other, mortal elevated to near divinity. Yet behind the splendor, shadows gathered, historical fragments, inscriptions half buried in the earth, tablets cracked with age, accounts of foreign emissaries, hint at a ruler both feared and adored. She decreed festivals of staggering extravagance, demanding her subjects pour wealth into temples so that her image might endure in stone. Taxes crushed farmers, while aristocrats simmered with quiet rage. The priests, who once anointed her with sacred oils, began to whisper of omens, eclipses that darkened the sun, comets that streaked across the heavens like flaming swords. In this culture, death was not an end, but a continuation of rule. The afterlife was imagined as a mirror of the living world. Palaces beneath the earth, servants at one's beck and call, meals of honeyed wine and roasted lamb carried into eternity. To die alone was to risk power dissolving in the void. To die accompanied was to preserve one's authority forever. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence across ancient civilizations, buried with their lords, warriors sealed beside their kings, concubines lain in rows beside queens. These silent testimonies of bone and grave goods show us that what seems monstrous to us was sanctified ritual to them. It is within this belief system that the queen's terrible decree was born. She was not the first to demand human sacrifice upon her death, but the scale of her command shocked even her contemporaries. 40 lives chosen from her household and guard were marked to follow her. Some may have seen it as an honor. Others, condemned by proximity to her favor, found their devotion twisted into chains. But why 40? In fragments of ritual texts, the number 40 recurs as a symbol of cosmic balance. 40 days of mourning, 40 steps to the temple's sacred chamber, 40 offerings to complete a rite. To the queen, it may have been not merely superstition, but a proclamation of divine order that she, in death, would hold sway over a perfect company of souls. Still, cracks ran beneath the grandeur. In private diaries of foreign traders, faded scraps preserved by accidentia is described as a woman of fire, whose gaze devours, whose hunger is without end. Another tablet records a rebellion quelled with rivers of blood, the queen commanding her soldiers to leave no survivor. Legends claim she walked through the battlefield herself, her sandals stained, her voice calling for silence among the dead. The people's fear of her was matched only by their reverence. To disobey the queen was to defy the gods, she claimed, as her lineage. And so, when whispers spread that her health waned, whether from poison, disease, or the slow corruption of age, the court trembled. Who would succeed her? Would the throne survive her absence? The queen had an answer, one that froze every soul who heard it. She declared that her death would not end her rule, for she would build a palace beneath the earth. Her tomb would be her kingdom, and her loyal servants would dwell within it, attending her as they had in life. In the shadows of the palace, preparations began. Priests murmured incantations while masons carved deeper chambers. The chosen 40 were selected, that guards, attendants, even a favored physician. None dared protest. Their loyalty, once a choice, had become their doom. It is here that the true darkness of her reign reveals itself, not in the battles won or the wealth she amassed, but in the quiet terror of those whose lives became currency for her immortality. The queen's legacy was being carved not only in stone but in blood, and as the years drew to her final breath, the curse that would stain her name for centuries had already begun. The palace of the queen was not only a house of stone and splendor, it was a crucible of secrets, betrayals, and whispered prayers that turned to curses once they reached the wrong ears. To understand why her tomb became a pit of living sacrifice, we must step into the tense web of politics and faith that wrapped itself around her reign. For her throne was not secure by birthright, but by fear, and fear must always be fed. The kingdom over which she ruled was ancient, its gods older than memory. Every stone in the temple bore the names of kings who had come before, each claiming divine sanction, each proving it with blood. To rule was to be both priest and sovereign, a living bridge between heaven and earth. The queen was an anomaly. Few women had ever ascended to the throne alone. To the priests, she was both miracle and threat. In murals painted on crumbling plaster, the queen is depicted standing before the sacred fire, her hand raised as if commanding the flames themselves. Scholars believe these images were more than flattery. They were propaganda, meant to seal her authority as one chosen by the gods. Yet behind such symbols simmered tension. The priesthood, whose rituals bound the people in cycles of offering and sacrifice, found itself divided. Some hailed her as divine incarnate, others whispered she was a usurper, a woman cloaked in ambition more than holiness. Political fractures widened as her reign endured. The nobles, each with their own estates and armies, bristled under her taxation. Grain levies grew heavy, silver vanished into temple treasuries, and artisans were conscripted to build monuments, not for the gods, but for the queen herself. Murmurs of revolt stirred in taverns, carried on the lips of soldiers who had seen too much hunger and too little glory. Yet rebellion never ignited, for the queen's hand was swift and merciless. Her spies filled the palace like shadows at dusk, and those who plotted too loudly vanished, swallowed by the dungeons or the desert sands beyond the walls. Archaeologists, uncovering fragments of correspondence letters, baked in clay and hardened by fire, speak of purges within the court. One noble writes, in trembling strokes, of seeing his brother dragged away by guards in the dead of night, accused of treachery for refusing to offer his daughter to the queen's household. Another tablet records the abrupt cessation of a noble family's lineage, their name chiseled from monuments, their estates parceled among loyalists. Erasure itself became a weapon. Religion, too, bent under her will. Though the gods had their temples, the queen built shrines where her image stood beside theirs, her figure painted with divine attributes, wings of the falcon, the serpent coiled at her feet, the moon carved above her brow. To many, it was blasphemy. To her, it was survival. The line between mortal and divine blurred until, for her subjects, opposing the queen was no different from defying the heavens themselves. Foreign emissaries came and went, leaving behind records of awe and unease. One from the east described her court as a place where silence has teeth. Another from the north wrote of banquets where golden cups overflowed with wine, or outside the palace gates, the poor starved in streets littered with the unburied dead. Such contrasts fueled resentment, yet also cloaked her in dread majesty. A ruler who could feast amid famine was one who seemed untouchable, beyond mortal law. But within the palace walls, the queen was not untouched by mortality. Her body, though draped in silks, bore the toll of years and disease. Physicians whispered of fevers, of wasting sickness that stained her lips red and left her trembling behind curtains of linen. She denied weakness publicly, appearing in festivals adorned with jewels that reflected the sun like fire. But those closest to her knew the truth. She was dying. Here lies the heart of her decree. The queen feared what would come after. Without her, factions would rip the kingdom apart. Rivals would desecrate her memory, shatter her monuments, erase her lineage as she had erased others. Death alone could not be trusted to preserve her power. But if she descended into the afterlife with an army of attendants, if she created a mirror kingdom below the earth, then even in death she would reign unchallenged. The priests, bound by her authority, could not refuse. They cloaked the horror in ritual, speaking of companionship in eternity, of 40 souls offered as guardians. The number was sanctified, justified by sacred numerology, until what was cruelty became ceremony. The nobles, silenced by fear, accepted it. Some even offered their own servants to prove loyalty. Among the chosen 40 were not only attendants, but also those who had once questioned her, an ironic twist cloaked as honor. To be buried alive was called the queen's final embrace, but in truth it was a punishment, a silencing of dissenters under the guise of devotion. The curse of the queen was not written in prophecy. It was forged in politics, sharpened by religion, and sealed by her will to defy even death itself. And so the tomb was prepared. Its corridors stretched deep into the earth, lined with murals of her victories, its chambers filled with offerings, cups, carved idols, jars of honey and wine. Yet behind every treasure lay the shadows of the living, whose breaths would soon fade beneath the stone. The queen was crafting not only her afterlife, but her curse upon the living, that her death would demand more lives than her reign ever had. The tomb was almost ready. Its walls glimmered with pigments stolen from crushed gemstones. Its corridors breathed with the scent of incense that masked the stench of earth newly torn open. Yet no paint, no incense, no golden idol could silence the terror of those who had been chosen to enter it alive. There were 40 souls, drawn from the queen's vast household, servants who once brushed her hair with ivory combs, attendants who poured her wine, who fanned her in the heat of summer, guards who stood silent at her chamber door, their armor polished like mirrors of bronze. Some were loyal, some were guilty, of nothing more than misfortune. Others were enemies, condemned and now cloaked in the false honor of companionship in eternity. On the night the list was read aloud, silence fell upon the palace like a burial shroud. Witnesses later wrote of muffled cries in the women's quarters, of guards who trembled as their names echoed down marble halls. Some fell to their knees in prayer, calling to gods who had long since turned deaf. Others struck their heads against stone, begging the queen's officials for mercy. But mercy had no place in her vision of eternity. One story, preserved in a fragile papyrus found centuries later, speaks of a girl named Azet, no more than 14, whose only crime was carrying a tray of figs and spilling them upon the queen's robe. She was marked as careless, unworthy of serving in life, and thus chosen to serve in death. Another tale tells of a guard named Menk, whose loyalty had once saved the queen during a palace riot. His reward, in cruel irony, was to be buried at her side, as a protector forever. The rituals began weeks before the interment. The chosen 40 were separated from their families, housed in chambers near the tomb, where priests whispered chants meant to soothe them. They were bathed in oils, dressed in linen garments finer than they had ever worn in life. Each was told they were blessed, exalted, chosen to walk with the queen in the afterlife. But beneath the surface lay dread so thick it turned even sacred. Songs into dirges some resisted. Records suggest 2 men attempted to flee under cover of night. They were captured, beaten, and displayed publicly as examples of cowardice. Their fate was crueler still. They were buried alive not within the tomb, but beneath the temple courtyard, their cries muffled beneath layers of stone, while priests sang hymns above them. Not all fought. Some surrendered, with eerie calm, convinced that serving the queen beyond death was better than dishonor in life. To them, the weight of tradition crushed any thought of rebellion. Generations had been taught that rulers were not merely human but divine. To refuse was to curse oneself, to wander the afterlife as a restless ghost. In their final days, many clung to this belief like a drowning man clings to driftwood. When the day arrived, the procession began at dawn. The queen, frail but was carried upon a golden litter to her half-finished tomb. She watched, her eyes glinting with fever and triumph, as the chosen 40 followed behind in silence. To the crowds that gathered, it was spectacle, ritual, an affirmation of divine power. Yet to the condemned, every step was a drumbeat of doom. Inside the tomb, the atmosphere thickened. Torches flickered against painted walls that depicted the queen seated among gods, her hand raised in eternal command. The servants were guided into side chambers, each assigned a space where mats and jars of food had been placed, as if they would feast forever in the dark. Some clutched amulets of protection, small carved scarabs pressed into their palms by weeping family members. Others clung only to silence, as though words themselves had abandoned them. The priests moved with ritualistic calm, their chants echoing in the stone passages. Each victim was offered a cup of wine laced with opium, disguised as ceremony, a way to dull terror and hasten surrender. Some drank eagerly, collapsing into dreams before the stone sealed them in. Others refused, preferring to face death awake, eyes wide, as the last light of torches was taken away. Then the masons came. One by one, the chambers were sealed. The sound of chisels striking stone rang through the tomb like the heartbeat of death. The air thickened, dwindled. Whispers became gasps. Gasping turned to scratching. Scratching gave way to silence. For days afterward, some said they could hear faint cries beneath the earth when the wind was still. A shepherd claimed he heard singing in the night near the tomb's entrance. Whether it was the voices of the priests or the last echoes of the buried, no one could say, but those who heard never forgot, and the tale passed into legend, the 40 who walked alive into death, condemned to guard their queen forever. Yet even in her triumph, the queen had sown the seeds of her curse. Among her people, fear curdled into hatred. Mothers whispered warnings to their children, "Do not cross the queen, lest she call you to her tomb." Priests, though obedient, carried unease in their hearts, fearing that such blood-soaked rituals would anger the gods more than appease them. And deep in the earth, in chambers without light, the 40 did not sleep peacefully. Their restless spirits would become the true guardians of her legacy, not in loyalty, but in vengeance. The queen believed she had built eternity. In truth, she had built a legend of horror, a wound in history that would never heal. The queen's final days unfolded beneath a sky that seemed to darken earlier than before, as though the heavens themselves were withdrawing their light from her reign. She had long been sick, her breath shallow, her skin marked with spots that no physician could cure. And yet, even as death crept closer, she clung to her vision of eternity, demanding that the tomb be sealed only once her body was safely within its golden coffin. The servants had already been entombed. Their cries had faded into silence. The masons had resumed their work in the deeper passages, carving seals into stone so that no living hand might disturb what had been buried. But the queen still lingered, half alive, watching her empire from the shaded courtyards of her palace. Some said she drank strange potions to prolong her life, bitter brews of herbs, resins, and blood. Others whispered that she fed on sacrifices, believing that life could be stolen and stitched onto her own. Whether true or not, her eyes glowed with a feverish light that made even her physicians recoil. And then, one night, thunder split the skies. A storm fell upon the capital with sudden rage winds that tore the banners from the palace roof, rains that flooded the courtyards. In the chaos, a hush fell upon the royal chambers. The queen had stopped breathing. There were no tears. Her courtiers moved swiftly, as though her death had been expected. Priests rushed forward, reciting prayers that rose and fell like waves upon a cursed shore. The body was bathed, perfumed, and wrapped in linen so fine it shimmered like water. Her golden mask was placed over her face, its cold features smoother and more beautiful than the flesh beneath. She was lifted, carried not as a woman but as a goddess, into the night storm. The funeral procession wound through the city's streets, torches struggling against the rain. Some citizens wept, for fear or tradition. Others turned their backs, spitting into the mud as her bier passed by. To them, she had become not a mother of the people, but a devourer of souls. The 40 entombed had already turned her legacy into a shadowed curse dot at the tomb's entrance. Lightning split the sky once more. Priests raised their arms, calling on the gods to bless this passage into eternity. The coffin was lowered into the main chamber, surrounded by treasures, jars of honey, baskets of dates, chariots dismantled and placed like offerings to the gods of the underworld. Around her coffin stood statues of the 40 who had been buried alive, carved hastily by trembling artisans. Each statue bore the face of a servant, their eyes carved wide in eternal obedience. Yet the stone eyes seemed not loyal, but accusing. The masons sealed the chamber, one stone, then another, until the queen's body disappeared into eternal silence. The sound of the chisels rang against the walls like iron bells, and with each strike, the living felt the weight of the dead pressing closer. When the last stone was placed, the high priest smeared it with resin and pressed the royal seal into its surface. He whispered words recorded in brittle texts. Centuries later, she shall rise eternal. She shall command forever. She shall never be alone. But eternity was not as she had imagined. Almost immediately, strange stories spread. Guards stationed near the tomb reported hearing wailing at night, like voices carried on the wind. Some said the ground trembled, as if fists struck from beneath the earth. A mason, driven half-mad, swore that when he placed the final stone, he heard laughter, broken laughter, echoing from within. Within weeks, he was found dead, his body twisted near the riverbank, his face frozen in terror. Politically, the queen's death left a vacuum. Ministers who had lived in fear now scrambled for power. Generals whispered of rebellion. Priests, once her loyal servants, began to distance themselves from her memory, fearing that her cruelty had stained the favor of the gods. In marketplaces, people spoke her name only in hushed tones, as if summoning her spirit would bring misfortune. Her dynasty cracked, alliances shattered. Within a generation, her line was erased from the king lists, her monuments defaced, her statues dragged into dust, yet her tomb remained untouched. No one dared to open it, not for treasure, not for revenge. To break its seals was to invite the wrath of 40 restless spirits and a queen whose hunger had not died. For centuries, the tomb lay in silence, buried deeper as sand swallowed the valley. But silence was not peace. The people remembered. Mothers frightened their children into obedience with tales of the cursed queen. Soldiers told stories around fires of how her shadow walked at night, her eyes hollow yet burning. Scholars debated whether her rituals had indeed bound her to eternity, or if she had merely doomed herself to a legend darker than death itself. What was certain was this: her quest for immortality had succeeded, but not in the way she imagined. She was remembered not as a goddess but as a curse. Her name endured not in reverence but in dread, and in the deep, where torches never reached, 40 servants remained her companions, not in devotion, but in eternal chains of suffering. Queen had won eternity, but eternity had turned against her. The desert wind carries whispers. Even today, if you walk the valley where her tomb lies buried, you feel the air thicken, as though history itself is watching you. Stones shift beneath your feet, and sometimes, in the silence between gusts, you could swear you hear the faint echo of voices muffled, distant, trapped. Centuries after her death, her story resurfaced in fragments, broken tablets, scorched manuscripts, tales whispered by descendants of those who had lived under her reign. Archaeologists, digging under layers of sand, uncovered strange carvings, figures bent in chains, eyes carved hollow, their mouths open in voiceless screams. One tablet bore an inscription, worn but legible: "She will not go alone." The curse of the queen was not just superstition, it was the memory of a cruelty too vast to forget. Even when her dynasty's name was erased from king lists, even when her statues were shattered and thrown into pits, her presence endured, not as a ruler, not as a goddess, but as a lesson carved into the soul of a civilization. The opening image, the tomb, silent, sealed with 40 lives, entombed within, returns here. Now, as the ultimate irony, what she sought was eternal companionship in death, a guarantee against loneliness in the afterlife. But what she created was something darker, a chamber of eternal unrest, a wound that never healed. Legends say the servants' souls still wander, searching for the freedom denied them. Some claimed that storms rising over the valley were their screams tearing through the sky. Others swore that no bird flew above the tomb, as if nature itself shunned the place. Whether these stories were born from superstition or truth matters little, for the human heart believed them, and that belief gave them life. And what of the queen herself? In some texts, she is remembered as a visionary, determined to bend death to her will. In others, she is remembered only as a monster who turned her fear of mortality into an ocean of suffering. Perhaps she was both. Perhaps she was simply human, flawed, desperate, and consumed by a terror greater than any army, the terror of being forgotten. In the end, she achieved immortality, but not the kind she craved. Her name lives not in gold or in song, but in fear, in curses whispered by firelight. She became proof of a truth as old as humanity itself, that cruelty cannot preserve a legacy, and that those who try to chain others to their own eternity will find themselves bound in chains far heavier than death. The sands continue to shift, the tomb remains sealed. Scholars debate, legends grow, and the queen waits in darkness. She waits with her 40 servants, companions, prisoners, shadows. And so the story ends as it began, with a tomb, silent and suffocating, a monument not to immortality but to the futility of power. History has not allowed her to escape. She whispers still, but her whisper is a warning. Power fades, gold turns to dust, monuments crumble, but cruelty is remembered. The queen wanted eternity. She found it, and eternity, in turn, made her a curse.